makers, I'm Katherine from Minerva, and today we are going to stitch up the Zadie Jumpsuit by Paper Theory Patterns. Let's get into it. So here at Minerva, we have made it nice and easy for you. We've put together a kit with all of the materials that you are going to need to stitch this up, including a printed paper pattern. So let's go over everything that you're going to need for doing this jumpsuit.
Okay, so we have this beautiful custom printed fabric here, which has such a gorgeous drape as you can see. And then, of course, a printed paper pattern here. It has a wide range of sizes, 6 through 28, and two options with sleeves and then a grown on shorter sleeve as well. Next up, we're going to have matching thread, of course, to stitch this up. And then, of course, you are also going to need some needles here, and we include that in the kit as well. And last but not least, a custom tag here for you to add into your project.
So I have linked everything down below, including this kit, as well as others with a number of different fabric options to select. So if you want to grab this up, it's nice and handy for you. Now let's get into actually stitching this up. Now, before I cut into my fabric or even my pattern, I always like to trace it out. That way I am keeping all of the sizes of the pattern. So I am just going to go ahead and trace that out. And then I am going to cut out the pattern pieces from my fabric, paying careful attention to the grain line of the fabric. And one of the areas that you are going to want to pay particular attention to is going to be for the bias binding that goes around the neckline edge. That is cut on the bias or the diagonal. So you do not want to cut it along the grain of the fabric. You want to cut it on a nice big diagonal, and the reason for this is because it is going to allow your fabric to stretch around the curves and the neckline, and you will not get the correct results unless you cut it on the bias. It's going to be very difficult if you don't do that, so please don't skip that step. And now that we have everything all cut out and ready to go, let's get into actually stitching this up.
Okay, so to start, we are going to stitch up the bodice. So with this, we are going to take our two back pieces and we are going to place them right sides together. And then I am just using some pins here to hold it in place and just making sure that I've got those seams matched up perfectly. So once we have this pinned, we're going to stitch and then you're going to overlock or serge the edges. So don't forget to backstitch at the start and end of each one of your seams. Unlike in quilting, garment sewing, you have to lock those stitches so it doesn't come apart on you. And once we have that done, let's pop on over to the overlocker and serge these edges here. And so with this, I am just trimming down just a hair off of that seam allowance here. Then let's take it to the pressing board and let's give it a press. Now, it doesn't really matter which side you decide to press it to, just choose one of the sides here. And I like to use a bit of steam on this fabric to hold it in place. Next, we've got our notches on the back. These are for our pleats, and we are going to pleat them towards the outside of the bodice. So take the one end of the notch and bring it over to the other end of the notch and pin it in place. I like to pin at both ends of the fold. So let's do that one more time. One end of the notch to the other notch, and then pin each of the ends. Then we are going to stitch within that seam allowance. So you don't want to go over that seam allowance because we want to hide these stitches within the seam that we are going to sew when we attach the bodice top to the bodice bottom or the pant bottom of the jumpsuit. So I'm just going in and basting these down. And it should look just like so. So next, we are going to take the bodice front. We're going to do the same thing. Once again, we are going to put the pleat towards the outside of the body here. And this is the wrap front, so we're just going to tack them in place. Now for the shoulder seams. So we're going to place right sides together the bodice front and both pieces of the bodice back. So the back and the front together along these shoulder seams. And then we are going to pin or clip in place just along this seam here. And we are going to do that along both sides. And then go ahead and stitch down there. And then we are also going to serge those seams just to finish that off. And it should look just like so. Now, if we were adding sleeves, this is the portion where we would add those sleeves. But we are not doing sleeves on this one. This one is going to be a short sleeve version. So with this, then we can go ahead and press that shoulder seam. I always like to press towards the back of the garment for all of my shoulder seams. And so just go ahead on both sides and press that seam towards the back. Now, if you don't have an overlocker, you don't need one to finish these seams. You can zigzag or do a French seam or any other type of seam finish. Next, we're going to overlock each of these edges individually, so not together. So you can see I've got them finished individually. They are not seamed together. This is a very important part on this step, so make sure you finish that first. Then we are going to pin this side seam together on both sides here. And then you will also notice that I have a little dot only on the one side. And you are just going to transfer that pattern marking on only one side of the bodice, front and back. And that dot is very important because on the one side, we're going to stitch all the way along the side seam. On the other one, we're going to start at the sleeve and stop at the dot and leave a little tiny opening at the very end. So you can see we're starting at the top of the sleeve and I'm stitching all the way down until I get to that dot. Then I'm going to backstitch and I'm going to end that seam, leaving a little gap right here that you can see. So it opens up just at the bottom. Very crucial that we leave this in here. So you can see we have these stitched in place with the opening on just one side. Next, we are going to stitch the neckline edge, but we're going to stitch this entire neckline edge. So up and around this curve, going all the way down the back and then around the other curve here. And I actually like to go up until the notches that you have on that crossover front portion. And make sure that this is also within that seam allowance because we don't want to see that stay stitching once we've stitched the main seam allowance. So next, I am going to take my sleeve roll and I am going to press these side seams here. Now, I found I didn't need to clip into these curves. It's just a very gentle curve and it didn't cause any puckering whatsoever. Press them open, and I like to start at the sleeve end and then go down towards the bodice, especially on the one with the opening. Because when we get to that opening, when we press it, we want to make sure that we're pressing it exactly so that it matches up perfectly as if it were already stitched. And once we have that done, you can see we've got our little opening right here. The next thing that we're going to do is top stitch this. So you don't have to add the pins in. I did just to hold everything in place, but go ahead and stitch right close to the fold down here, just like so. So it's stitched in absolutely beautifully. It's going to keep everything in place. Next, we are going to sew the pants portion of our jumpsuit. So with this, we are going to grab, these are the pant fronts, and we are going to do the pleats. So you can see how we have these two pleats here. Once again, we are going to fold these pleats, and these ones now pleat towards the center, the side seam of the trouser. And so we are going to do that on both sides here. I was just making the pleat a little bit bigger. I noticed the notch wasn't cut through on that second piece there, so I had to go and transfer it over. And then just like you did to the bodice, baste that in place, and it should look just like so. And this is the back piece here. You can see that big curved crotch seam there. We're going to do the pleats in the exact same manner. So I'm going to speed this up for you a little bit since this is the fourth time that we are looking at this pleat here. And then go ahead and baste it in place as well. Now to sew the pockets. So with this, we are going to take the front portion of the pants and we're going to line up the pocket bag. So there's a little diagonal on that pocket bag and we're going to match it up to the diagonal that is on our front of the pants. Then we're going to go ahead and we're going to stitch and then overlock that edge. So you can see we've got it just like so. And then I went ahead and understitched that so that when we fold the pocket to the inside and understitch on the pocket bag side, when we give it a nice good press, you are not going to see that pocket bag at all because it really helps everything to lay nice and flat. So once we have that in place, we're going to fold it over, and you'll notice that there are some notches that can help you along the way in matching up the bottom of that pocket bag with that side seam there. But right now we're going to focus on the bottom of the pocket bag, pinning just the pocket bag together, stitching, and then serging that. Now we can flip it to the front, and this is where those notches come into play. So those notches are going to match up with the edge of our pocket, and then there's another notch at the bottom that matches up to where that pocket opens up on the side. And we're just going to match that up going all the way down, adding some pins in, and then baste those in place to hold your pocket piece in place. And your pockets are completed, and you'll see it is open on the backside, a little flap just like so. Now back to the pant legs. So with this, we've got our front, and we're going to place it right sides together with a back piece. And we are going to pin and sew this inseam here. So I like to pin at the top and the bottom, and then I like to pin in the center and just distribute the pins evenly as I go. That way I'm ensuring that everything is matching up. And we're also going to do the out seam at the exact same time. Now you're going to repeat this process for the second set of front and back legs. You've got one for the right side and one for the left side. So stitch and overlock that as well as the other side. And so I am just stitching in here and keeping it nice, and I've overlocked it, catching that pocket bag in that seam. Turn one of the pieces right side out. Keep the other one inside out. Then place the one that's right side inside the other one so that right sides are facing. First, match up the center crotch seam and make sure that that seam is nested. So one seam allowance goes to the right and one goes to the left. So that's really important so that you reduce the amount of bulk that's right at that crotch seam. And then match up the notches and place your pins going down the seam here. And then we're going to head on over to our sewing machine and we are going to stitch it. And of course, you guessed right, we are also going to serge or overlock that seam or finish it in whatever finishing technique that you are using to create this jumpsuit. So I've jumped on over to my overlocker, and this is where I am going to be just cleaning up those seams and going in, and right before you hit the end, or where we had switched between the front and the back. This is the front, so you can see this is where the little notch is, where we're supposed to stop stitching. You want to come off. So you see how I've run off, and I've only went up to that drill mark or that dot. So this is really, really, really important. So you don't want to go all the way up, or you're not going to be able to get that wrap in there. And you also don't want to go all the way to the end on the overlocking. Otherwise, you won't be able to attach the bias binding, which we're going to do at another step. Okay, so now we're going to join the bodice to the pants to create a jumpsuit. So we have the bottom of the pants, and this is the top bodice. So we're going to place them right sides together. I like to start at the center back, and then of course I like to nest those seams similar to how we did on the crotch. Now I'm just going to pin this in place, but before I do that, I wanted to show you this diagram that they have in the instructions, just showing you this is a side seam where you have that slit that's going in. I'm doing the center back right now, but it's a fantastic diagram, especially if you're a beginner, to reference to know exactly how everything should match up. So that you know, center back matches center back. All of the little pleats that we made will match up, and the center side seams, they are going to match up as well. Now, the only tricky part on this is where you have that point that comes to that curve. You're just basically going to take that point and it's going to taper out into that curve. And there are some notches there to help you guide that process. But once you get to the end, you can just kind of see how that tapers off. And it just comes in nicely like this. We're going to stitch it, and then we are going to overlock it as well. Okay, so I've got that stitched in place. You can see I've got it overlocked. I also have pressed it to make it a little nicer. And you can see all of my pleats match up. My side seam matches up. My back matches up. And this is the side seam that has the hole. That is where we're going to put the belt tie through to create this wrap. So on that note, we're going to stitch the belt ties. So take the belt tie and we're going to place it right sides together along the long end, and we are going to stitch that, leaving both the diagonal and that straight short edge open. This is so that we can effectively turn this belt with great ease. So once we have that pinned, go ahead and stitch. I like to overlock it for extra security. And once that is done, I like to take the straight edge and put a pin through it and then feed it all the way through. And so I am just going to speed this process up because I'm sure if you are an experienced sewist, we have all went and turned a small tube from time to time. If you have any questions, leave them in the comments down below. So next, we're going to press this. And so we're going to press it, paying careful attention where we roll to the edge of that seam to make sure that our belt is maintaining the same width all the way across. And then when we get to the end, you'll see we have a diagonal end and a straight end. On the straight end, that's going to be the end that you're going to see. You're going to fold it in, give it a good press, and then top stitch it down. That's what it says in the instructions. Now I'm going to do something a little bit different. I'm going to top stitch all the way around my belt tie. Now the reason I do this is because it makes it so much easier when you wash it and it doesn't crinkle up. And if you ever have to press this again, it makes for easy and fast work on this. Plus it gives a little bit of a style detail with that top stitching there. Okay, now we need to attach these belt ties. So this is where the diagonal comes into play. So we want to place the diagonal not so that it is going down, but so that it points up towards the top of the bodice, just like so. So that's going to be crucial. Otherwise, it's not going to be facing the right direction. So go ahead and pin that in place and then baste it. And you want to place this on the wrong side of your jumpsuit. So not on the right side. So belt to the wrong side and above that waistline seam. So you can see I've got that basted in place. And now it is going to be on to the neckline bias binding. So we're going to create our own bias binding so it matches our fabric. We're going to create a cross in the fabric here, and then we are going to stitch diagonally from corner to corner to join this, similar to how you would join a quilt binding. And then I decided to press my seams open to reduce the bulk as much as I could. Next, you would want to fold into the center with a little gap in the middle so that we can create bias binding. But if you have a bias binding maker, you can utilize that. So I'm going to try out this size and see if it fits. You can use a pin to really get it through the end and get it started. But when I pull it through, I notice that it's overlapping a bit, meaning this one is too small. So I grab one size up, pull it through, and you can see that there is a small gap to allow me to turn the fabric and turn it into a bias binding. This one is absolutely perfect. If you have the same set that I am using here, it is the blue one, and I think it was a 26 millimeter one. And then go ahead and press it. Now, if you don't have one of these bias binding makers, that is okay. Just do it by hand and it'll turn out just fine. This just makes it a lot quicker when you're doing it. And once you have created these folds, the next step to create the bias binding is to, of course, fold it in half so that the edges match. And then just go along the rest of this, making sure that all of the edges match up. And we've created a nice long piece of bias binding. Now, you can see all of the different folds. You've got that center fold and all of the folds going in to create our bias binding. Then we're going to do the bias binding along the entire neckline, being sure to catch the ties in that bias binding. So you want to make sure that the ties are not going to get caught in them. So make sure that they're out of the way, and don't start your bias binding right at the edge of the seam. Send it out a couple of inches. This pattern gives you enough to have a little bit of tail on either end, both the start and the end, to help start those stitches. So I am using clips rather than pins because I find the clips to really work nicely with this slinky fabric here. And just continue to do that all the way around. But if you're going to be adding a label like this wonderful Minerva Maker label, go ahead and add it in on the center back, baste it in on that neckline before you get the binding in. So let's continue to add that binding in here. And so I am just going in, and you can see that I've got it in there, and it's going to get covered once we get this in. So continuing over, now this I wanted to show you right where we have the ties coming in, how I am going over this curve where the ties are. I'm using a lot of clips. You can see some of them are right next to one another. I just want to make sure that I'm effectively covering that belt tie with the bias binding. So then just continue to do the rest of them going all the way down. I'm just going to speed this process up a bit because it's pretty self-explanatory on this end in getting that in. And then you'll have a nice long tail at the end to both start and end the bias binding, and which we will trim off in a future step. So let's start on the one side, and then we are going to stitch close to that folded end, going through both sides of the bias binding. So you can see that I am following the edge of the clear portion of my presser foot to do that. And I've got the bias binding all on, and I have got my ties are all caught beautifully in there. And it is looking quite nice. No spots have been missed. The next thing is fold your ties out and then top stitch along the top. This will help your ties to lie flat how they're supposed to be because the seam wants it to go on the inside. We want them to go to the outside. And then we need to trim off these ties, but also if you remember, we did not finish our overlocking stitches along the front of the crotch seam. Well, this is where we're going to do that. Just go in and overlock it. So you can see we started over here, we've overlocked it, and the overlocker also trimmed off those stitches as well, or those big tails that we had, and we've top stitched the ties in place. And then we can feed the tie through the side little hole that we have. So you can feed the one side through so that we have the wrap starting to take form here. You can see I've got the one tie going in, and then we would wrap through the other side. You can tie it in the front, you can tie it on the side, in the back, whatever your heart desires. There's enough length there to do a couple of different style details with your jumpsuit here. So next we are going to hem the sleeves. So I like to use my pressing hem to fold over these sleeves here. We're going to fold over a nice little narrow hem. And so we're going to do a double fold hem here. A nice trick, which I didn't do on this instance, is to serge the ends, and that gives you the perfect amount to fold over. I just did it with the raw hems on this end, but to make it your life a little bit easier, you can definitely do that, and then you don't have to measure at all. And then go ahead and top stitch that in place on both sides of the sleeves, just like so. Now to hem the pants of our jumpsuit. So we're going to do this in nearly the same way. So we're going to get out our pressing hem and we are going to press this. I like to work from the wrong side going up. Now we are going to fold this up, I do believe 1.5 inches according to the pattern. And we're going to do that first because we want this hem to be very precise. Do try on your jumpsuit ahead of time to find out if you need to adjust that hem to make it longer or shorter depending on what style length you would like to go for. And then once you have that in place, that's where we're going to fold it down. I'd say about 1.2 centimeters, maybe 1 centimeter down, and press that in place. And then that's what we're going to top stitch. So it's not a double fold hem because the first fold was the entire hem, and then the top of the next fold is a slightly smaller hem, but it's a very similar idea to that. Once that is all pressed, we are going to stitch that. So we are just going to start and follow the edge of the fold on that top fold of the hem, going all the way around. And don't forget to backstitch. I always like to start at the inseam so you don't see that start and stop of the stitch as much. It's a little trick that I like to do to help hide that. And our jumpsuit is all complete. And we are now finally ready for the final reveal to see what it looks like.
And now that we have this all stitched up, you are ready to rock your Zadie jumpsuit at your next event. If you have any questions at all on this process, do let us know in the comments down below and we'll be sure to get back to you as soon as we can. And if you're not already a member here, do consider becoming a member. It's completely free and a great place for you to share all of your fun sewing and creative makes here on Minerva. And if you want to check me out here on Minerva, I can be found at Sheer Stitchery. I'll link my profile down below. Until next time.